I wasn't looking for evidence of a calendar reset, but then I found the ledgers. Certain account books from the period depicting municipal expenses, harvest schedules, birth registries. They appeared in county archives tucked between property deeds and tax assessments. Nothing marked them as significant, but something about them refused to settle. The dates were wrong, the month designations inconsistent, and the sheer number of them scattered across institutions suggested a pattern I couldn't explain. They were official records, government documents, financial instruments requiring legal precision. And according to our current calendar system, the dates they contained shouldn't exist. It began with a single ledger, a municipal accounting book from 1867 showing quarterly expenditures. The entries followed standard bookkeeping practice. Neat columns, careful penmanship, the kind of documentation small-town governments maintained for audit purposes. But the date headers included references to a 13th month. Not an error in a single entry. Not a clerk's abbreviation or shorthand notation. Systematic documentation across 3 full quarters showing a month our calendar doesn't contain. I started collecting similar records: Philadelphia, Lyon, Buenos Aires, Melbourne, Irkutsk. Each archive told the same story. Official documents following proper administrative procedures, but recording dates in a calendar system that doesn't match what we're told existed during that period. Not scattered anomalies across centuries, but concentrated documentation from a specific 40-year window. The pattern was impossible to ignore. It began with a single document. Certain ledgers from the period depicting financial transactions, harvest records, birth registries, we're told followed the Gregorian calendar adopted centuries earlier. The entries showed dates in a 13th month, a month with no name in our current system. The caption in the archive catalog identified it as a standard municipal record from 1867. Standard, except for the dates that couldn't exist within the 12-month calendar we use today. I started checking other archives. The chronology repeated with disturbing exactness. Philadelphia, city records from 1871. Accounting ledgers showing fiscal year calculations spanning 13 months. Lyon parish registers from 1863, baptismal dates recorded in Month XIII with the same matter-of-fact notation as January or July. Buenos Aires commercial invoices from 1869. Payment schedules extending into a 13th monthly period. Melbourne census documentation from 1874. Population counts organized by a calendar structure containing an additional 30-day increment. Irkutsk, timber harvest logs from 1866, recording yields across 13 distinct monthly cycles. Each archive told the same story, not isolated scribal errors, not confused abbreviations, but systematic documentation of dates our calendar doesn't contain. The records weren't marginal or unofficial. They were government ledgers, church registries, commercial contracts. The foundational documents societies use to organize time and obligation, and they all showed the same thing. A 13th month. 30 days that don't exist in the calendar, we're told, was universal by the mid-19th century. Let's examine what we're told about calendar reform. The Gregorian calendar replaced the Julian system beginning in 1582. Catholic Europe adopted it immediately. Protestant regions followed over the next century. The Eastern Orthodox world transitioned later. By 1800, we're told, the Gregorian calendar had achieved near universal adoption for civil and commercial purposes. 12 months, 365 days. The system we still use today. But these documents show something different. They show institutions across 6 continents maintaining a 13-month calendar well into the 1870s. Not resistance to Gregorian adoption, not lingering use of older Julian dating. A distinct system with a distinct structure that our historical narrative doesn't acknowledge. The question becomes unavoidable. Where did these dates come from? Not confusion about Julian versus Gregorian conversion, though. The mathematics are too consistent, the documentation patterns too systematic, the institutional adoption too widespread. You don't independently develop identical calendrical errors across continents. You don't maintain extensive governmental and commercial systems based on dates that don't function. You record what existed. Some of these documents reveal details that should vary wildly across different administrative traditions, but they don't. The same 13th month designation appears in ledgers separated by 8,000 miles. The same 30-day structure. The same positioning after what we call December. The same integration into fiscal quarters and seasonal cycles, as if the administrators were working from a common template. A template our calendar history doesn't include. This presents a coordination problem. We're expected to believe that record keepers in North America, Europe, South America, Australia, and Siberia independently decided to add an identical 13th month to their documentation, that they arrived at the same structural solution without communication, that they integrated this additional month into governmental, religious, and commercial systems without leaving any trace in our historical understanding of how calendars developed. The official explanation doesn't exist. There is no official explanation for these dates. The documents simply aren't discussed in chronological scholarship. When they appear in archives, they're cataloged without comment. When researchers encounter them, they're assumed to be clerical peculiarities. The pattern isn't acknowledged because acknowledging it would require explaining where a 13th month came from and why it disappeared. The evidence points to something far more expansive. Certain documents from the period depicting the transition between calendar systems reveal their own anomalies. Not the dates themselves, but how they were changed. I started checking astronomical tables from the same period. The calculations weren't simple. Creating a functional calendar requires precise understanding of solar cycles, lunar phases, seasonal drift. The Earth's orbit doesn't divide neatly into months. Any calendar system represents a compromise between astronomical reality and human convenience. Getting that compromise right demands sophisticated mathematical modeling. The documents I found showed calculations that went beyond simple timekeeping. Astronomical tables from the 1860s and 1870s, preserved in observatory records and navigation archives, contain predictions for celestial events calculated to dates our calendar doesn't recognize. Not vague approximations, precise predictions. Solar declination angles for specific days in month 13. Lunar phase calculations extending into the 13th monthly cycle. Seasonal marker predictions aligned to a calendar structure we're told didn't exist. These weren't theoretical exercises. Observatory logs show these predictions were used. Ships' navigation records reference them. Agricultural planning documents cite them. The tables functioned because they reflected a calendar system that was operational. We're told calendar reform was a matter of political and religious authority. The Pope decreed the Gregorian calendar in 1582. Protestant nations resisted for decades or centuries. The Eastern Orthodox world maintained the Julian calendar into the 20th century. But resistance to adoption doesn't explain the creation of an entirely different system. It doesn't explain why that system would incorporate astronomical calculations more complex than either the Julian or Gregorian calendars attempted. The precision of these astronomical tables poses its own questions. Calculating solar and lunar positions for a 13-month calendar requires understanding the mathematical relationships between Earth's rotation, its orbit around the Sun, and the Moon's orbital period. You need accurate measurements of the tropical year. You need correction factors for accumulated drift. You need prediction models tested against observed reality over multiple cycles. Where did this astronomical expertise come from? Not in the frontier towns and colonial settlements where many of these documents originated. We're talking about calculations produced in locations supposedly lacking educational infrastructure, scientific institutions, or trained astronomers. Yet the work shows expertise comparable to what major European observatories were achieving. The calculation methods themselves reveal inherited knowledge. These aren't exploratory attempts to create a calendar. They're refinements of an existing system. The tables show correction factors, accumulated adjustments, sophisticated handling of remainder days that only make sense if someone already understood the problems a 13-month calendar would encounter and had worked out solutions over time. You don't develop that expertise in isolation, you inherit it. Some of these documents reveal details that should vary wildly across continents, but they don't. The same month designation appears in ledgers separated by 8,000 miles. The same structural conventions, the same astronomical reference points integrated into date notation, the same methods for handling the transition between Month XII and Month XIII, as if administrators across the globe were following identical protocols. A commercial invoice from Boston dated 1868 shows the 13th month designated as Month Supplemental. A parish register from Lyon uses the identical term, translated into French. Municipal records from Buenos Aires employ the Spanish equivalent. Observatory logs from Melbourne use the same designation in English. Timber contracts from Irkutsk, when translated, reveal the same nomenclature. Not similar terms, identical conceptual framing. Supplemental suggests the month was understood as an addition to a 12-month base structure. That understanding appears uniformly across documents from regions with no official communication about calendar systems. Either this represents convergent terminology, multiple cultures independently arriving at the same conceptual framework, or it represents a shared inheritance. The astronomical anchoring points show the same consistency. Documents from different continents reference the same celestial events as markers for when month 13 begins and ends. The winter solstice appears repeatedly as a reference point, not the solstice as calendar decoration, but as a functional boundary. The 13th month in these various documents consistently aligns with a specific window of the solar year centered on the solstice period. This presents a coordination problem that goes beyond administrative convenience. We're expected to believe that record keepers in North America, Europe, South America, Australia, and Siberia independently decided to create a 13th month, independently chose to call it underscore, quote underscore two underscore, and independently anchored it to the same astronomical event, all without documented communication or shared authority directing these choices. The official explanation is convergent evolution, similar needs producing similar solutions, humans everywhere tracking the same solar year, encountering the same calendrical challenges, arriving at similar innovations. But convergent evolution doesn't explain identical terminology. It doesn't explain the repetition of specific astronomical anchoring points, and it certainly doesn't explain why these solutions appeared simultaneously across the globe during the same 40-year window, then vanished just as uniformly. The evidence points to something larger. A pre-existing calendar system, globally distributed with standardized conventions that local administrators continued using even as official narratives, promoted the Gregorian calendar as universal. The consistency suggests this wasn't innovation, it was inheritance. Certain documents from the period depicting official records reveal their own anomalies, not the dates themselves, but how they were changed. The ledgers show corrections, dates crossed out and rewritten, entire columns adjusted by exactly 30 days, margins filled with conversion notations in different ink, different handwriting, sometimes decades after the original entries. I obtained access to original documents, not photocopies or transcriptions. Physical examination reveals patterns invisible in reproductions. A municipal ledger from Philadelphia shows entries from 1871, originally recorded in the 13-month system. Someone later returned to the document and added marginal notes converting each date to the 12-month calendar. The conversion ink differs from the original. Chemical analysis suggests the corrections were made 15 to 20 years after the initial entries. This pattern appears across multiple institutions. A parish register from Lyon contains baptismal records from the 1860s. The dates were originally recorded in month 13. At some point, someone systematically overwrote these entries, adjusting every date forward or backward to fit the 12-month calendar. The overwriting is careful, methodical, not corrections of errors, deliberate reformatting of accurate records into a different calendrical framework. Commercial documents show the same treatment. Shipping manifests, payment schedules, warehouse inventories. Original entries in the 13-month system later adjusted to 12-month dates. The adjustments follow consistent rules. Dates in month 13 get redistributed, most pushed into December, some into January. The modifications maintain the same day-of-week relationships, suggesting whoever made the changes understood both calendar systems well enough to preserve weekly cycles while altering monthly designations. Some documents preserve both dating systems simultaneously. A census record from Melbourne dated 1874 shows dual notation. The primary date uses the 13-month calendar. A marginal note provides the 12-month equivalent. This represents a transition period when administrators needed to maintain both systems. either for their own reference or to satisfy different institutional requirements. The physical evidence indicates systematic institutional directives, not individual clerks fixing mistakes. The inconsistency across documents from the same institution suggests coordinated conversion efforts. The timing of corrections, concentrated in the 1880s and 1890s, points to organized campaigns to align historical records with the 12-month calendar that had, by then, become officially universal. Employment records and census documents show something more troubling. Birth dates, death dates, marriage dates originally recorded in Month XIII were adjusted to fit 12-month conventions. Someone went through vital records and systematically erased references to dates that no longer existed in the accepted calendar. Not wholesale destruction of documents. Careful alteration. Preserving the records while removing evidence of the calendar system they originally used. Where did the directives for these corrections come from? The documentation is sparse. Institutional archives from this period rarely contain explicit orders to modify historical records. The few administrative memoranda that survived mentioned calendar standardization, alignment with national timekeeping conventions, modernization of record formats, nothing acknowledging that the corrections involved changing dates from one functional system to another. They adjusted the dates, updated the records, and moved forward as if the previous system had never existed. 30 days. I obtained transition records from several institutions. When these documents exist, and often they don't, they reveal timelines that border on impossible. A municipal government in Sacramento switches calendar systems in 3 weeks. The transition required reprinting all official forms, retraining every clerk in date conversion procedures, updating all ongoing contracts and legal documents to reflect new dating conventions. 3 weeks from announcement to complete operational changeover. The institutional requirements for such a transition extend beyond paperwork. Every clerk, every administrator, every official dealing with dates needed to understand both the old system and the new one. They needed conversion tables. They needed to know which historical dates to preserve unchanged and which to adjust. They needed protocols for handling documents that bridged the transition period. Getting this coordination right, even in a small municipal office, would require weeks of preparation before implementation could begin. Yet the records show no preparation period. The transition appears instantaneous. Documents from early 1882 use the 13-month calendar. Documents from late 1882 use the 12-month calendar. The changeover happens within a span measured in days, not months. No interim period of confusion. No corrections from clerks using the wrong system. No documents showing mixed dating conventions from administrators still learning the new framework. Religious institutions show the same pattern. A Catholic diocese in Boston maintains parish records in the 13-month system through June 1883. By July 1883, all records use the 12-month calendar. The diocese encompassed dozens of parishes, each maintaining independent registries of baptisms, marriages, deaths. Coordinating simultaneous adoption across that network would require centralized directives, training sessions, distribution of new record books formatted for the 12-month system. The archival record shows none of this preparation, only the abrupt change. Commercial enterprises faced even more complex challenges. Shipping companies operating on international routes needed calendar systems compatible with ports of call. A company using a 13-month calendar for internal operations, but dealing with ports using 12-month systems, would need conversion protocols for every bill of lading, every customs declaration, every delivery schedule. Switching systems meant reconciling existing contracts, updating payment schedules, recalculating interest on loans structured around monthly payments in a calendar that would suddenly have different monthly divisions. These aren't reasonable timelines, even with modern communication infrastructure and standardized training programs. In the 1880s, coordinating such transitions would require postal correspondence, printed circulars, in-person training sessions. The logistics alone should have taken months. The implementation, working through backlogs of existing documents and contracts, should have taken years. But the pattern repeats with disturbing exactness across institutions and continents. A government office in Lyon, 3 weeks. A commercial house in Buenos Aires, 4 weeks. A university in Melbourne, 2 weeks, all showing the same characteristics. No preparation phase, no transition errors, no gradual adoption. Instantaneous, system-wide change. Not the reason, not the conditions, not the communication technology available. How? The sanctioned explanation falls apart at this point. We're told calendar standardization was a gradual process driven by practical necessity and international coordination, that institutions adopted the Gregorian calendar as they recognized its advantages, that the changes reflected rational administrative modernization, but rational processes leave traces: preparation, implementation challenges, learning curves. The historical record shows none of this. It shows coordinated, instantaneous change on a global scale. Some of these documents reveal what filled that 30-day period. Not empty time, not a mathematical correction, but a functioning month with documented activities, harvests, celestial observations, and social patterns. Agricultural records from the American Midwest show grain harvest cycles organized around the 13th month. Specific crops planted in what we call late November, harvested in month 13, stored before the January planting season. The timing wasn't arbitrary. It aligned with soil temperature patterns, frost cycles, optimal storage conditions before winter fully set in. European viticulture records show similar patterns. Wine production logs from French estates detail fermentation schedules extending into month 13. The timing corresponded to specific temperature ranges crucial for certain wine varieties. Pressing in early December, initial fermentation through month 13. Completion in what we call January. The month served a functional role in production cycles that required precise environmental conditions. Astronomical tables from the period show celestial events marked specifically during month 13 that our current calendar handles awkwardly. The winter solstice appears consistently, but also specific stellar configurations, planetary positions, lunar phase relationships that the 13-month system tracked with dedicated observational protocols. These weren't decorative notations. Observatory logs show systematic recording of these events during the 13th month, measurements taken, calculations updated, data used for navigation and agricultural planning. Cultural records suggest the month held social significance. Parish registers from various regions show clusters of marriages, baptisms, and other ceremonial events during month 13. The clustering isn't random. It appears tied to specific dates within that month, suggesting traditional observances, seasonal celebrations, or religious practices aligned to the 13-month calendar that have no clear equivalent in our current system. We're told the Gregorian reform corrected astronomical drift accumulated under the Julian calendar. The 10-day adjustment in 1582 brought the calendar back into alignment with the solar year, particularly the spring equinox. But drift correction doesn't explain the erasure of a functional month with documented observances and practical applications. It doesn't explain why a system that tracked agricultural, astronomical, and cultural cycles with apparent precision would be abandoned for one that handles those same cycles less elegantly. The agricultural disruption alone should have generated resistance. Farmers operating on cycles refined over generations don't easily adopt new timing systems. Yet the records show no protests, no gradual transition period where some regions maintained old practices while others adopted new ones. The harvest cycles simply shift. Dates that fell in month 13 get redistributed into December and January. The same activities continue, but the temporal framework changes. This level of coordination suggests either universal acceptance based on clear advantages, which the agricultural evidence doesn't support, or impose standardization backed by authority that could override local practice. But what authority could coordinate such changes across independent nations, different religious traditions, separate legal systems, all within the same narrow time window? The month wasn't empty. It served specific functions in the rhythms of agricultural production, astronomical observation, and cultural practice. Its removal required recalibrating all those systems to function within a 12-month framework. Some of these adjustments remain visible in our calendar's awkward handling of winter solstice timing, the uneven distribution of days across months, the misalignment between our calendar and optimal agricultural cycles in various climates. Around the mid-1880s, something changed. Documents using the 13-month system cease. The agricultural records stop referencing month 13. Observatory logs shift to 12-month notation. Cultural practices tied to specific dates in the 13th month either disappear from documentation or get reassigned to December or January dates that don't quite align with the original timing. Not a gradual phase-out, a rupture. I reached out to chronologists, institutional archivists, calendar historians. I asked simple questions. Where is the documentation of the transition from 13 months to 12? Why do municipal records from the 1860s and 1870s show dates our calendar doesn't contain? What happened to the agricultural and astronomical observances marked in that missing month? The silence was overwhelming. Not hostility, not defensiveness, just disinterest, as if the questions themselves were irrelevant. The Gregorian calendar was adopted in 1582, refined through the following centuries, universally recognized by the 19th century. The timeline is documented, therefore it's accurate. The system is settled, therefore no investigation is needed. But the archival record isn't settled. It contains systematic anomalies that the standard chronological narrative doesn't address. When I pressed archivists on specific documents showing 13-month dating, the responses followed predictable patterns: clerical errors, confusion between old and new style dating, misunderstood abbreviations, local idiosyncrasies that don't reflect broader practice. These explanations don't account for the scale. We're not discussing isolated anomalies in a single archive. We're discussing patterns across continents, consistent structures, identical terminology, systematic documentation spanning decades. Clerical errors don't coordinate globally. Local idiosyncrasies don't produce universal conventions. I requested access to institutional records documenting the calendar transition. Municipal archives that should contain circulars, training materials, administrative directives explaining how to convert from one system to another. The requests produced remarkable consistency in their results. Documents not currently available, records transferred to off-site storage, materials undergoing conservation, access restricted pending catalog updates. When access was granted, the results showed their own patterns. Archives with extensive municipal records from the 1860s and 1870s meticulously preserved tax rolls, property deeds, court proceedings, but calendar transition documentation conspicuously absent, not missing randomly. Specifically, the materials that would explain how institutions managed the changeover. Church archives revealed similar gaps. Diocesan records preserving centuries of correspondence, administrative decisions, theological debates. But nothing addressing how parishes transitioned from recording dates in Month XIII to recording them in the 12-month system. The change simply happened. One year the registers show 13 months, the next year they show 12 with no documentation of the decision-making process, no instructions to parish priests, no theological justification for altering the calendar framework. Some archives show physical evidence of removal, bound volumes of municipal proceedings with missing pages. The removal isn't haphazard, it's surgical. Volumes from 1881 through 1886, the apparent peak transition period, show gaps specifically in sections that would have addressed calendar standardization, administrative reforms, institutional policy changes. The pages weren't lost to deterioration. They were cut out cleanly, leaving stubs visible in the binding. University libraries holding 19th century scientific publications show similar patterns. Astronomical journals from the 1870s and early 1880s are complete, but specific issues that would have addressed calendar reform, astronomical table updates, changes to temporal reference systems, those issues are consistently absent from otherwise complete runs. Not lost copies, removed copies. The catalog cards remain, showing the issues existed, were accessioned, then disappeared from the collection. The pattern extends to government archives, national repositories that preserve legislative records, policy debates, administrative reforms, show comprehensive documentation for every aspect of 19th century governance, except calendar reform. Debates over currency, transportation infrastructure, public health initiatives, all thoroughly documented. Calendar standardization, which would have affected every government function, appears nowhere in the legislative record. Precisely where documentation should be most robust, we find erasure, not the gradual loss that time inflicts on all records. Deliberate, systematic removal of evidence, files missing specific pages, journals missing specific issues, archives missing specific document categories. The gaps aren't random. They correlate exactly with the calendar transition period and the types of documents that would explain what happened. The few historians willing to engage eventually retreat behind the same refrain. Insufficient evidence for alternative explanations. The 13-month documents are anomalies. The absence of transition documentation is unremarkable. The synchronized global changeover required no coordination because institutions independently recognize the advantages of calendar standardization. Insufficient evidence. The documents themselves are evidence. The astronomical tables are evidence. The agricultural records, the altered dates, the surgical removal of archival materials, all evidence. The question isn't whether evidence exists, it's whether we're permitted to examine it honestly. The findings are typically sealed away. The archives proceed according to policy, and the discoveries vanish into restricted storage where they never see scholarly examination. What did our calendar look like before the reset? And why does that earlier form remain so carefully hidden? A document that wasn't meant to stand out shows an almanac during an estate auction in the 1950s. The auctioneer listed it as, quote, 3. The format was unusual because it contained 13 months. The item sold to a private collector for minimal cost. Unusual, but not valuable. A curiosity, not evidence. The almanac wasn't an error. It was printed commercially, distributed widely, used practically. The pages show we're consistent with regular consultation. Margin notes in multiple hands indicate it passed through several owners. The notes reference planting schedules, astronomical observations, weather predictions, all keyed to the 13-month structure. This wasn't a theoretical document, it was a working tool. Once you know what to look for, similar items appear in unexpected places. Museum collections cataloged as, quote, 4 or, quote, 5 private libraries, holding almanacs, ephemerides, and calendrical tables that institutional archives won't acknowledge. Estate sales, where these items appear mixed among standard household goods, recognized as old but not understood as significant. Some of these artifacts show remarkable sophistication. An astronomical instrument acquired by a university museum in the 1920s, cataloged as ornamental astrolabe, origin uncertain. The instrument isn't ornamental, it's functional. The calibrations on its rotating discs correspond to a 13-month calendar. The celestial calculations it enables work. They produce accurate predictions for stellar positions and planetary movements, but only if you're using a calendar structure our system doesn't recognize. Architectural elements preserve evidence that can't be easily erased. A civic building in Philadelphia, constructed in 1872, contains a decorative ceiling panel showing calendrical symbolism. 12 months represented by traditional zodiacal imagery, and a 13th panel showing winter solstice imagery with astronomical notations. The Building Commission's records describe it as representing the complete solar year, not 12 months, the complete year. Similar architectural features appear in buildings from the same period across different cities. Public libraries, courthouses, banks, structures built when the 13-month system was still in use, incorporating calendrical representations that include the missing month. These weren't decorative mistakes, they were intentional representations of the calendar their builders used. The evidence exists in plain sight, overlooked because we're not looking for it. Museum collections contain the tools. Buildings display the symbols. Private collections preserve the documents. But without the context of the 13-month system, these items get classified as anomalies, errors, regional peculiarities. They're recognized as old, sometimes as unusual, but not as evidence of a different calendrical framework. This pattern appears in multiple contexts where preservation occurred outside institutional control. Family estates maintaining almanacs and ephemerides through generations. Private collectors acquiring unusual calendrical instruments. Buildings constructed before the transition, displaying architectural elements that later generations couldn't interpret correctly. The objects weren't errors. They were tools for a calendar that preceded our own, and someone reclassified them so we'd never recognize what they represented. Let me be precise about what we're examining here. Between approximately 1850 and 1890, institutions across 6 continents maintained a 13-month calendar system, alongside or instead of the 12-month Gregorian calendar. This occurred during a period of limited international communication, separate governmental authorities, and supposedly independent timekeeping traditions. The calendar appeared in municipal records, religious registries, commercial documents, and astronomical tables. It showed consistent structure, identical terminology, and coordinated astronomical anchoring points across regions lacking centralized calendar authority. The system required sophisticated astronomical knowledge to create and maintain. The calculations involved precise solar and lunar tracking, seasonal drift corrections, and mathematical modeling that supposedly didn't exist in many of the locations using it. Yet the documentation shows these calculations being performed accurately, the results being applied practically, and the system functioning for agricultural, commercial, and cultural purposes. The transition from 13 months to 12 happened with remarkable speed and completeness. Institutions switched systems within weeks. The changeover left no preparation documentation, no training materials, no evidence of the logistical coordination such a change would require. Records simply shift from one calendar to another, as if the transition required no institutional effort. The missing month wasn't empty time. It served specific agricultural functions, aligned with astronomical events, and contained documented cultural observances. Its removal required recalibrating all systems dependent on its existence. Harvest cycles, astronomical predictions, seasonal celebrations, all had to be redistributed into a 12-month framework. This recalibration appears to have happened uniformly across different agricultural zones, climate regions, and cultural traditions. Documentation of the transition has been systematically removed from archives, not lost through time or neglect, but deliberately excised. Missing pages in bound volumes, absent issues from journal runs, gaps in legislative records precisely where calendar reform should appear. The removals are surgical, targeted, and consistent across independent institutional archives. Physical artifacts preserving evidence of the 13-month system exist but have been reclassified. Functional astronomical instruments cataloged as decorative. Working almanacs dismissed as printing errors. Architectural representations of 13-month calendars interpreted as regional oddities. The evidence persists, but its significance has been obscured through institutional misclassification. The conventional explanation requires us to believe in remarkable coincidences, that institutions across 6 continents independently developed identical 13-month calendar structures, that they independently chose identical terminology and astronomical reference points, that they independently decided to abandon this system at the same time, transitioning to 12 months within the same narrow historical window, that this massive institutional change required no coordination, no documentation, no preparation period, that skilled astronomical calculators appeared in locations lacking educational infrastructure to train them, that the transition left no resistance, no confusion, no adjustment period, that agricultural systems recalibrated instantly, despite depending on timing refined over generations, that cultural practices tied to specific dates in the 13th month simply vanished without documentation. That evidence of all this was independently removed from archives across different nations, institutions, and archival traditions. That physical artifacts preserving the 13-month system all happened to be misclassified in similar ways. That modern chronologists can find no institutional memory of any of this, despite it occurring barely a century ago. And that questioning any of this marks you as pursuing fringe theories rather than following documented evidence. How many coincidences before we're obligated to consider alternative explanations? I didn't start this investigation believing in calendar resets or erased chronologies. I found ledgers that didn't align with accepted explanations and followed the inconsistencies wherever they led. They led here to a pattern of 13-month calendar documentation appearing globally within a narrow historical window, maintained with astronomical expertise that shouldn't exist in frontier conditions, coordinated in ways we can't explain, and erased from institutional memory through systematic removal of evidence. These weren't simple record-keeping errors, they were comprehensive calendrical systems requiring sophisticated understanding of solar cycles, lunar phases, and seasonal transitions. They appeared in places that couldn't produce such knowledge independently, operated for decades with documented practical applications, then vanished as if they had never existed. The pattern is too consistent to dismiss, the evidence too substantial to ignore, the silence too deliberate to be coincidental. What knowledge did this calendar represent? Who possessed the astronomical expertise to design and maintain it? What came before the dates where our current historical narrative begins? And what happened to erase both the calendar and the civilization that created it from institutional memory? The documents remain. The almanacs still exist in private collections. The architectural elements persist in buildings constructed during the transition period. The astronomical instruments function for those who understand their calibrations. The evidence survives despite generations of careful reclassification and institutional neglect. But the answers, those are sealed behind archival restrictions. We're told protect fragile materials, hidden in documents we're assured were lost to fire or flood at remarkably convenient moments, buried beneath explanations that require impossible coincidences but remain unchallenged by chronological scholarship. I wasn't looking for proof of a calendar reset. I was looking for an explanation that fits the evidence, and the further I examined the documents, the clearer it became. Whatever created these calendrical systems, it wasn't the independent institutions we see in our history books. It was something larger, something older, something that maintained unified timekeeping across continents before our accepted chronology acknowledges such coordination was possible. And someone made very sure we'd never know what it was. The calendars stand as monuments to that erasure, functional, sophisticated, and utterly unexplained. What else did we inherit without knowing its origin? And what else was taken from us before we even knew it existed?